Today, we are exploring a model created to simulate purchasing behavior in the context of fast fashion. This model examines how individuals in a social network make eco conscious purchasing choices, especially when it comes to fast fashion. By analyzing how different factors influence decision making, the model offers insight into the conditions that might lead individuals to move away from fast fashion purchases. So, before we get into the details, could you please introduce yourself and share a bit about your background?
Yes, my name is Daria Soboleva, and I am currently a student for economics at Duke University. And at the time of developing that model, I was a student at University of Carlos III in Madrid, and I was a master's student in applied mathematics.
So, to begin, can you outline the primary objective of this model? What aspects of consumer decision making are you focusing on, and how does the model capture the influence of various factors on fast fashion purchasing behavior?
Yeah, so the goal of this model and this project overall was to try and understand how the knowledge of the environmental consequences, consequences on working conditions, and um, just the well-being of people that make fast fashion clothing affects the people that purchase it. Um, Buying clothing and just overall dressing, how people dress, it's something that is conditioned by almost fully conditioned by the society that one lives in, and it's not an innate thing. And so, knowing that fast fashion is very destructive for the environment and also um, for people that make it, we wanted to see if we can find how knowledge about this and influence from outside can potentially guide people to buy less clothing. And in order to do that, we first needed to know, well, why, not maybe not necessarily why people buy fast fashion, but what they take into consideration when they buy clothing, especially focusing on, do it take into consideration how it affects the environment? Do it take into consideration who made those clothes, the cost, maybe what their peers think? And we wanted to see whether more influence from social media that is against fast fashion and more influence from the government that is against overconsumption of fast fashion, if it would influence people enough to reduce the overall consumption of it. And um, so we focused on three influences from peers. So that would be opinion and behavior, because those are different influences and both of them have an effect separately. Then influence overall from using social media, and we call it governmental influence. That can be policies, maybe taxation on fast fashion purchases or just clothing purchases, campaigns and things like that. Maybe just advertisement. And yeah, we wanted to see if a network of agents, which simulates a population, a small population, could overall shift its habits on average, setting these influences to different values and having different parameters associated with them.
Uh, what were some of the most significant challenges you faced in building this model? Was it complex to simulate the interplay of influences and their impact on eco-conscious decision making?
Yeah, so the biggest difficulty was determining why people buy clothing they buy, why they shop where they shop. We had a very complete data set on many consumers, on like 1,000 consumers in Spain. So it was focused obviously on the Spanish market, and it was difficult, very difficult to choose what uh, answers to what questions signify what. and to determine like, well, this set of answers is going to reflect how this person cares about the environment. Or this set of answers is going to determine how much they care about working conditions and what they consider before when they buy clothes. And this is going to determine their susceptibility. And so that was a very much objective choice that we had to make that might be subject to criticism, but we did our best at doing it. And obviously determining how people share opinions regarding fast fashion, how it influences, how your choices of clothing influence your peers' choices. It's very difficult to quantify and to determine. There's many things that come into it, so we had to simplify it a lot, but not to an extent that it's unrealistic. And yeah, and then it's a model that one can work on for forever, because there's things that you can keep adding up as much as you want. And so we also had to draw a line where we're going to stop with adding things and adding parameters to it, which was also a hard line to draw, because it always feels like we can add more things and make it more realistic and make it more complete.
Moving on to the insights gained from the model analysis, what key patterns or behaviors have emerged? Have any surprising trends appeared regarding how individuals' choices shift in responses to, the factors influencing them?
Yeah, so this doesn't necessarily come from the model itself, but from the data, we learned that working conditions of people that make the clothing, environmental concerns have very little effect on people's purchasing decisions, even if they are aware of these problems, which was obviously upsetting, because this means that even if people know that this has a negative impact on a range of things, they would still choose to shop at fast fashion brands. So that made it difficult to influence the behaviors through these things, just because this knowledge has very little influence on the decision making overall. And we needed to add other things like taxation, for example, because the cost of clothing has a much larger impact on where people shop, whether comparing to environmental concerns. And that was one difficulty, and also like insight, I guess, from working on this project. Regarding the model, we experimented a lot with polarized versus non-polarized agent sets. So where in one, people's opinions tend to homogenize over time, and another where they don't. That was very interesting to see how, if a topic isn't perceived as a controversial one, it tends to be easier to guide people towards the desired action, which is intuitive, versus in polarized, it's a lot more difficult. But at the same time, we see that the effects of campaigns and social influence are longer lasting in polarized agent sets, because they are once, essentially, in simple terms, once a topic becomes talked about, people continue to talk about it more if it's polarizing for them. So that was interesting to see how a polarized agent set it's not necessarily bad. A polarized society, to an extent, is not necessarily bad. We also experimented a lot with sizes of friend groups and levels of susceptibility. So how different levels of susceptibility towards social media versus towards government campaigns will have a different effect on the overall equilibrium of the system. So yeah, there were tons of results from this model, and hard to summarize them all. But I think there are hundreds of combinations of parameters that one could try, and just the results are different or similar, even when parameters are different, and so on.
You have made this model available through ComSys.net. Were there any specific challenges, in sharing this model, or, about how to document the model?
Yeah, so The biggest challenge was I couldn't share the model the way it was just because it was initializing agents from a data set that I wasn't able to share. And it required some editing to be able to use it with essentially randomly generated data, or if people had their own data set that they wanted to use, we tried making it as user-friendly as possible and leaving as many instructions and as detailed as we could so that people could edit it and change it based on their data set to make sure that it actually worked. And there was a paper that was written based on the results of this model. So a lot of the results and justifications for functions and choices decision-making model were there. So it was relatively easy because it just implied sharing the paper itself.
So looking ahead, what do you see as the next steps for this model? And I mean, are there any plans to expand the model's focus to other areas?
One of our ideas was to potentially extend it to corporations, so companies, adding companies as agents within the model and learning how the interaction between demand and supply was going to change or develop. But right now it's kind of on pause. It would require translating everything into Python just because NetLogo is relatively computationally expensive to run, giving a large number of agents, and it would also require defining the relationship between companies and the supply, and then customers and their demand.